Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Guillermo Rodriguez. I'm the head of evidence and data here at THI, and I really want to welcome you to this, our fifth week of the Impact Festival. As you know, we have been conducting a series of online events over the last 5 weeks, and now we are going to have a brilliant, absolutely stellar group of leading academics who are going to be telling us much more around how we can use systematic reviews to activate and promote a better use of evidence to actually create change. Um, just a bit of a couple of housekeeping points before we start the session for the day. First of all, definitely start asking all of the questions that you might have down in the chat box and the Q&A box. Feel free to connect with all of the other attendees, and remember to continue the conversation on social media using the hashtag CHIFest 2020. Um, so just to kickstart the discussion a bit, we feel that systematic reviews are absolutely crucial in the evidence ecosystem because not only they are combining relevant information of all of the bodies of evidence, but also most importantly, if they are really to influence policy, we need to ensure that they are of the best quality possible. And this is exactly a reason why we have decided to use the best standards available internationally and establish this relationship with the Campbell collaboration. And that's why we have Howard White and Sarah Miller joining us today. But also really importantly, one of the key aspects is that systematic reviews for CHI are integrated in a logical pipeline that is basically discovering, generating, and synthesizing all of the relevant evidence, which is one of the aspects that makes our systematic reviews different somehow from the ones that are being conducted elsewhere. We also have Tim Aubrey with us for the discussion today, who is going to be discussing a lot more about how systematic reviews have been brought into homelessness, because it's one of those areas in which we didn't have an actual tradition of conducting these types of evidence synthesis. So with that in mind, I just wanted to highlight that this is a really important week for us because it's achieving a milestone. This week, we're going to be publishing our first systematic review ever after the foundation of CHI almost 2 years ago. There has been a lot of effort and a lot of time devoted into creating this systematic review. And Sarah is going to be saying a lot more about this first systematic review on discharge policies, and also the other ones that are coming just a few weeks later in accommodation, and also on access to services. So with no further ado, we wanted to start discussing with Howard a bit, who is the CEO of the Campbell Collaboration. So it would be great, Howard, if you can say a bit more about yourself, how you got into that role, and more particularly, if you can say a lot more around systematic reviews. We know that there are many challenges and there are many critiques around how systematic reviews have been used to influence policy. So if you can give us a couple of examples of how they have been used in the past to actually steer policies in specific ways, and how we can potentially start mitigating some of the challenges that we are going to be facing. Over to you, Howard. And you are on mute right now.
I'm trying to share my screen right now. Let me be perfectly in the pilot. It's coming. There we go. Okay, thank you very much. I will try and answer some of the questions as I go along. We have a very short speak each. So I was asked to first introduce reviews, where they come from, the sort of motivation. So the rise of evidence-based policy and practice across all sectors, not just social welfare sectors like homelessness, it's education, it's crime and justice and so on, got its earliest impetus from health and is best known in the health sector. So I'm going to illustrate that in a moment. First, with an example of an influential policy study was one carried out in 1983 in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, which was about mandatory arrest. So mandatory arrest is where when police are called to an incident of suspected domestic abuse, they have to arrest the suspected perpetrator, regardless of what they find on the scene. And in the Minneapolis trial, they found that mandatory arrest reduced reoffending rate down to 13% compared to double that, 26% reoffending rate, with traditional sort of usual practice of temporarily removing the suspect from the home. So it seemed to be a very successful policy, and it was widely cited. It was in the New York Times. The author of the trial, Larry Sherman, was interviewed on TV and so on. And 20 years later, 3/4 of police forces across the US had mandatory arrest policies. So it sounds like a good thing. Here's a policy. There's a trial for a randomized controlled trial testing it, and it gets rolled out. But actually, 5 further attempts to replicate the program in different cities across the US did not get the same results. In 3 cases, there was no difference between mandatory arrest and traditional treatment, and in 2 cases, mandatory arrest was actually worse than traditional approaches. So the main point from that example is we can't rely on single studies. We shouldn't rely on a single study to infer what policy is successful or not, because context matters, implementation matters, and so on. And what we now know about mandatory arrest is it's effective with particularly more affluent, employed, particularly white middle-class males. It's not effective with people who are more traditionally anyway exposed to arrest and engagement with police forces. So you can't just take a single trial and study and say, oh, that program works. So the motivation for doing reviews was to say, well, there's lots of studies out there. Can we summarize what the body of evidence on a particular topic says? So what I'm showing now is the logo of the Cochrane collaboration, which is the health counterpart of Campbell. Cochrane does reviews in the health field, Campbell does everything else. And the logo is a stylized representation of a forest plot. So a forest plot, let me describe very briefly, shows the findings from single studies. So in this diagram, every one of those horizontal lines is a single study. And you have a vertical line, which is the line of no effect. So if the horizontal line crosses the vertical line, it says that study found no significant effect of the intervention on the outcome of interest. What is the intervention here? What are the studies about? The intervention is about giving a corticosteroid injection to a woman going into premature labor. Children who are born prematurely are much more likely to die overall between neonatal and perinatal death. And so the outcome of interest here is child death. And so when the horizontal line in the diagram lies entirely to the left of the vertical line, that study found a significant reduction in the likelihood of a child dying if the mother's given the injection as she goes into labor. You see there are 7 studies that were available when this review was carried out. And of those 7, only 2 found a significant effect, the other 5 found no effect. So a traditional narrative review would say, oh, they're mixed findings, we're not really sure what the effect is. There are no mixed findings, only poorly synthesized findings. If we dig down into the data and correctly analyze them, we can say what the evidence says. And in this case, when you carry out a meta-analysis, which is a statistical procedure for combining effect sizes across studies, you find, in fact, there's a 30 to 50% reduction in child mortality from giving this injection. It's a very cheap, cost-effective way of saving lives, and literally hundreds of thousands of children are alive today, not just because of this injection, but because this review was done. If this review had not been done, people would still be saying, oh, the evidence is mixed, we don't know if it works or not. It's a review that looks across all the available evidence and says, we know what's effective based on summarizing the body of evidence. So we need to summarize the body of evidence, and we need to do it in a high quality way, which includes doing meta-analysis where meta-analysis is possible. We don't use vote counting. Vote counting is, oh, there's 7 studies, 5 against, 2 in favor, so the intervention loses. Vote counting is wrong. It's the incorrect way to summarize studies. It doesn't take account of sample size, lack of precision in small studies, and so on. In this case, doing vote counting would actually literally kill babies, because people alive today who wouldn't be alive hadn't been for the meta-analysis done in this study. But there's other reasons why we should do literature reviews that we do in a systematic way. So let's give an example now from another area, which is mindfulness. Multisystemic therapy. Multisystemic therapy is very popular. It's a branded program, which means the group of academics in the US invented a program, a sort of family intervention, and they go out and sell the approach to states, districts, countries, and so on, so they can implement that program under license. This is a summary. What I'm giving you now is a summary of how one study in this literature, this paper by Molly Brunker et al., who has been reported by the study itself and by reviews of the literature. Note this study includes one of the authors, Scott Hegelar, who's one of the inventors of MST, the lead person behind MST. So the study is done by people who actually invented the program. A flag for conflict of interest there, but I'm not going to talk about that anymore. So this was a randomized controlled trial comparing MST, which is an intensive family treatment, with group parenting sessions. So it was a A/B design comparing MST against traditional group-based parenting classes. There's only 43 families, but quite a small study, randomized across these two treatment arms, looking at 30 outcomes across individual child functioning, family functioning, stress, and so on. If you look at the graph, you'll find of those 30 outcomes, one wasn't reported in the paper at all. They said they were going to do it, but never talked about it. 7 find a positive effect in favor of MST, sorry, 5 find a positive effect in favor of MST compared to parenting classes. 2 find a positive effect of parenting classes compared to MST. As out of 30 outcomes, 22 find no effect, no difference. So 22 out of 30 outcomes find no difference between MST and parenting classes. Reported, meaning what actually gets presented in the paper, you see that actually not reported has gone up a lot. So the 5 and the 2 that are significant are reported, but the majority of the outcomes where there's no effect actually are not discussed in the paper. When you get to the abstract, they don't talk about 2 outcomes, one favoring MST, one favoring parenting classes. The other 28 outcomes are not reported in the abstract. So the abstract doesn't tell you at all what actually that paper says, which on most outcomes, there's no difference in MST and parent training. And then we look in the final column. This is work done by Julia Littell in the Campbell review she did. She looked at 9 out of 9, she looked at 14 reviews of the MST literature, and 9 out of those 14 reviews only report 1 outcome from this paper with 30 outcomes. And the 1 outcome they report usually favors MST. So if you look at narrative reviews of MST, they say things like, oh, the Brunk paper, the one we're looking at, shows MST is effective. The Brunk paper shows MST is superior to group-based parenting. The Brunk paper shows MST families show greater improvements, blah, blah, blah. That's not true. The Brunk paper showed on 22 out of 30 outcomes, there is no difference between the 2 interventions, MST and parent training. The Campbell review on this topic shows no difference. Here's the forest plot. The black diamond crosses the vertical line, which means you see no effect. There's no difference between MST and parenting classes on out-of-home placement. There's no difference between MST and parenting classes on delinquency. There's no difference between MST and parenting classes on family cohesion. So the review shows, when you look at the literature properly, actually there's no difference between MST and parenting classes. So what a systematic review should do is summarize all of the data out there, the research reports and publications, and have a review that is a balanced reporting of positive and negative effects. What we get in reality, in most reviews, is reviews, there's bias in the research reports themselves, of emphasis on significant findings, there's publication bias in what gets published, and there's confirmation bias in selective presentation of results in the reviews themselves. So what we need to do is rebalance the evidence pyramid by doing systematic reviews that seek to minimize sources of bias of their traditional literature reviews, and stop doing narrative reviews. There are more than 100 narrative reviews on MST, mostly saying it works, when in fact it's no better or worse than a much cheaper alternative of group-based parenting classes. So there's the case for doing systematic reviews rather than doing traditional literature reviews. Campbell has published now, getting on for 200 systematic reviews. We document what we call policy influence stories. So, for example, our hotspot policing review was influential in several countries, particularly in Latin America, adopting hotspot policing and then doing their own RCTs on hotspot policing. If you look at the policy influence brochure on our website, you'll find about 50 cases showing how Campbell reviews have been used in national policy guidelines, or WHO used our deworming review, the WHO updated deworming guidelines last year, and so on. So across a whole range of policy spaces, we're cited in the media, Campbell reviews are cited in parliamentary debates, and so on. So we give examples in the brochure, and we have track these in real time. We have around 70 odd now policy influence stories from Campbell reviews. So around a third of Campbell reviews, we've got a direct policy influence story from that review. So what we're doing with CHI, and we're doing other What Works Centres in the UK, is based on this idea of the evidence pyramid. So on the top of the evidence pyramid are evidence-based decision-making products that allow decision makers, so people in social welfare offices, social work offices and NGOs and so on, to make decisions about evidence-informed decisions where they can make those decisions about policy and practice without having to go back and look at the underlying research studies. The lower parts of the pyramid, evidence platforms, evidence maps and databases, take you back to the studies. And what we know is that policymakers, decision makers, generally don't read academic papers. So the whole idea of the top of the pyramid is to make decision-making products allow decisions to be informed without having to go back and read the underlying studies. An example of that comes from the Education Endowment Foundation. It's the What Works Centre for Education for England. They have this teaching and learning toolkit, which most of the other What Works centres, including CHI, have modelled an intervention tool based on something like this. So in the toolkit, they have 38 different interventions. And for these 38 interventions, they've done systematic reviews. And based on that, they tell you what it costs, what's the evidence strength, and finally, what's the impact? The impact meaning what makes the child's learning outcomes. And you can sort by impact and see that giving a child feedback on their work has a large impact. It's like having an additional 8 months schooling, but it's very low cost, and the evidence is quite good. Whereas repeating a year, which costs a lot of money, actually sets a child back by 4 months. Bad thing to do. So this is a very powerful website. I thought this is the best website in the world. I really, really like it. And the remarkable thing is that 5 years ago, National Audit Office did a report and found that 2/3 of schools in England are using this toolkit to inform decisions about practice in the classroom, allocation of teaching resources in the school. So if you've done a systematic review that's in the toolkit, your evidence from your review is being used by 2/3 of schools across England. That's a remarkable achievement. You're doing research that is used by decision makers in 2/3 of schools across the country. So we want to do the same basically with homelessness and with other sectors we're working with, like youth crime in What Works Centre in the UK. So to build the top of the pyramid, to have the evidence portals, have the kinds of guidelines, you need the bottom of the pyramid. So you have to have the evidence base to build the bottom of the top of the pyramid. So what we do is start by doing evidence maps that basically say what's the bottom, what the pyramid look like. The evidence maps tell you the current state of the base of the pyramid. The evidence and gap map, as they're called, is a systematic representation of all available evidence per sector or subsector, where they have interventions categories in the rows and outcome domains in the columns. So here's an example for homelessness. This is the first one we did. So it had 227 studies in it, of which only 21 reviews. We're about to release the latest third edition, which will have 395 studies with 45 reviews in it. And these maps are interactive. So they're online. You can click on any cell and it will tell you, okay, in this cell, there are 11 studies of the impact of health and social care specialist interventions. We've changed the categories now, this is the old map, and the impact of those on overall well-being and quality of life. You can click on the cell and get a list of all the studies that appear in that cell. And you can click on any one of the studies in that list, get a database summary of about the study, and you can click on, so here's a summary, you can click on the URL and you can go to the, actually go to the study itself. So you get a link to the study itself or to the journal or working paper series where it is. And we have an updated software now, so you can search also the studies in the database. So when we put the next version out, Tim can go and search for his name and find we've got lots of studies from Tim in the map, which we do. So the map showed a very clear geographical imbalance. Again, in the first map, there are only 9 studies in the UK, where there were over 100 RCTs in the map, showing that impact evaluations, including RCTs, are very possible in the sector. But most of the ones that have been done have come from North America. The largest one actually is the Sheshwar study of phytosis in Canada, which Tim is one of the authors on. And we show there's a large sectoral imbalance. A lot of the studies that are there are around health, including substance abuse, and there is some on accommodation, but far fewer studies on, say, employment interventions for people experiencing or risk of homelessness. And the sector's under-reviewed. So in the first map, less than 10% of studies were reviews. Now it's 45 out of 395, so 11% are reviews. If you do a map in the health sector, you actually find more reviews than there are primary studies. They're over-reviewed, if anything. But in homelessness, they're actually far fewer than you would expect, and it's under-reviewed. So CHI used the map to promote use of evidence by promoting access to evidence through the map. The evidence becomes very discoverable by a map. Everyone come and go there and see, oh wow, there's nearly 400 studies of effectiveness. We have another map on process evaluations we're currently updating, around 250 studies. So maps between them have 650 studies. There'll be over 700 studies once we updated process evaluation. So the maps are the largest single global repository of evidence on homelessness. And so it's a real resource that CHI has put out there. So to make the studies discoverable. They used the map to say, well, where's there's lots of evidence but no reviews, and have commissioned the 3 studies from Belfast that Sarah will be presenting in a moment. And of course, they're encouraging rigorous studies of effectiveness in the UK. We don't accept the argument, oh, you can't do RCTs of homelessness. Yes, you can. It's been done in North US and Canada on a very large scale. Finally, I was on criticisms of reviews. So the biggest one we're getting from the UK community is the UK research community. Oh, you missed relevant evidence. You're only including RCTs and other impact evaluations. The response to that is systematic reviewing is a research method. It can be applied to any research question. So it can be applied to a qualitative research question or a quantitative research question. So the effectiveness map is about effectiveness studies, which have a comparison group or some measure of outcomes that can be validated. And so your study on lived experience of people experiencing homelessness, your study on the experience of caseworkers working with homeless people. They're valuable research. They add to our body of knowledge about homeless interventions, but they are not effectiveness studies. They're not in our map. So if we're doing the process evaluation map, we call the implementation issues map, then many of those process evaluations, they are included in that map. The process evaluation map has many more studies in the UK than does the effectiveness map, because that's the sort of research commonly being done in the UK. And we do encourage integrated mixed method reviews that call on both the effectiveness studies and the implementation studies, and Sarah's reviews do exactly, especially that. Reviews are expensive and take a long time. You get what you pay for. Many people say, well, I'm not going to pay you 60,000, 80,000, whatever, to do a review. I'm going to ask so-and-so, an expert in the field, to write a literature review to answer this question. And my response to that is, save your money, just ask her what she thinks already, because that's what her literature review will say. Because there are so many sources of bias literature reviews, you can predict what they're going to say depending on who's writing them. And whereas systematic reviews seek to overcome those sources of bias. And clearly, and finally, people say systematic reviews don't actually have any clear policy implications. That's simply not true. One of my jobs at Campbell has been writing plain language summaries or editing plain language summaries, and I've been surprised at the extent to which the vast majority have a clear headline summary and which has policy implications. It only doesn't where the evidence base is weak, the pyramid is empty, the base of the pyramid doesn't exist, so you simply don't have evidence. We're not going to go out and say this works or that doesn't work, if actually there are no studies. Well, there's 1 or 2 studies, but they're very weak. We had a much criticised review on female genital mutilation when I first started at Campbell. There are 6 studies, all of which are very weak before versus after studies with sample sizes of 12 people. So there's not a lot you can do with that. And so our conclusion was we don't know what works. We've got a lot of criticism from the academic community working this, saying there are hundreds of studies in this area. There are, but there are no studies of effectiveness. And so that's the case. We just have to highlight that. So we want everyone to join the evidence revolution. We're part of the evidence revolution. That's what the pyramid is all about. So it started, CHI is part of it. Let's all be part of it. Please go and visit our website. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Howard. I think that's absolutely interesting, and especially just taking the last point that you were making around how we can ensure that actually systematic reviews have really clear policy recommendations. It would be perfect to now move to Tim, who has been bringing these methodologies that are still relatively new in homelessness to the Canadian context. And it would be brilliant, Tim, if you can say a bit more about the challenges that you have faced in that process, and particularly which are the key insights and how those have been translated into changes in policy in your context.
Great, good. Thanks, Guillermo, and thank you, Howard. That's good context. Well, the systematic reviews, first thing I want to say that they're relatively homelessness, and I'm really happy that your center, Guillermo, has taken one of these on, and we'll get to see it and so on. You know, that it's been slow getting into this field, but it's happened finally. I mean, I think there's recognition that this is a visible, growing problem. The numbers keep going up. The population is diverse, and it's interesting when I come out of the community mental health field. You know, working around deinstitutionalization and helping people find a way of putting together a community. You can see that kind of precursor to this sort of homelessness, you know, the research act, different forms of case management.
Sorry, Tim. Is there anyone else having some problems listening to what you're saying? Sarah, can you, yes? Would you mind starting that again, Tim, because we were having some interruptions.
Oh, I see. Okay, sorry.
We can hear better now. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to give you just a little history, which is, you know, around homelessness, which is a kind of a late adopter in the systematic field. You know, if we look at Campbell collaboration, Cochrane collaboration, just years, but I think development. I think ACT, case management, were kind of precursors to start. There was rigorous research going on. It was keeping people out of hospitals. Also keeping people out of important. I think the exciting, obviously, thing happened, and we're really probably looking at only in the last 10 years, recognition that has through a number of trials has been shown to be incredibly effective across a whole different set of contexts. And I think that's really helped fuel systematic reviews. Now, there are barriers getting use of systematic reviews in this sector. You know, historically, if you look at how we've dealt with homelessness, faith communities have been in disparities. The whole social services, it's been through emergency shelters delivered by the observers to people. There's not a strong tradition of looking at the effectiveness of services or conducting research.
Tim, sorry, but we are still having a lot of noise from you. So would you mind turning off your camera? That might actually.
Yeah. How's that, Guillermo?
That sounds a lot better. Yes.
Okay. So I think the major barriers around getting into the homelessness sector, considering evidence-based interventions, things work. There's misbelief about emerging research. There's even a resistance to research in the sectors. And we find certainly in Canada, these are barriers that are prevalent and that we really have to target to make a difference. Now I'm going to show you just some work we're doing just around the issue of, some of the things we've learned. I'll share my screen. And any better? Are we? Can you hear me? Is it okay?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, listen, I'm going to go through these quickly just because of time. This is work that's being led by Kevin Potty. He had done some really interesting work around refugees. It goes back almost 10 years now. And the idea there was to bring people who were refugees into family practice, family physicians, take them on in a roster of patients. And his idea was to bring people who are homeless, to use the same model into the roster of patients of family practices. Because we was a bit of success of getting refugees, new people who were in the country into family practices. And it is to use systematic reviews, develop clinical guidelines. So I became involved in this because I was so involved in Housing First research over the years and involved in the at-home Chase project. We know that that it's a big problem, and health is an issue because of the circumstance, all kind of issues people face when they don't have a grown home. So this approach involved a series of steps that included a Delphi consensus team to look at needs. And initially there was a Delphi survey of different stakeholder groups with experience to try to identify the areas of intervention that would seem to be the most relevant for putting clinical guidelines for family physicians. And there you can see the different steps. There was a meeting where we found the consensus and the beginning of what we really we're going to be looked at in terms of interventions. And then there was systematic evidence reviews. And from there, there was recommendations that were related to guidelines, clinical guidelines for family physicians. It was done by a separate panel of people who were familiar with homelessness, who were involved in healthcare. We used the great evidence, and then there was a final summit to share the draft guidelines. We're just in the process now of moving the guidelines into the field. And unfortunately, the major article that came out in the Canadian Medical Association Journal, it actually came out the same day we had the COVID shutdown. So we weren't able to capitalize on the media and decided to hold off on doing the marketing. So you can see, the systematic review went through a set of interventions, what common outcomes. You can see the kind of numbers that came out of that. As I mentioned, we use the grade system, and we really tried to make it a multi-stakeholder engagement so that the clinical guidelines would be most relevant and useful. And then this just gives you an idea. This is related to housing, leaving homelessness. So you can see in the boxes relevant to what Howard was talking about, what the level of effectiveness is. Now, at the same time, the non-housing outcomes at this point are not all that impressive. And that's an issue in the Housing First field. You can see, but in terms of people leaving homelessness, the studies have found anywhere from 75 to even the upper range, 88% of people leaving homelessness, which is pretty impressive compared to treatment as usual. That's only about half that. So anyhow, this is a recommendation around a guideline. This is what would be put out to the family physicians based on the systematic review. You can see they're very simple, they're very straightforward, they're very concrete. It's a strong recommendation with moderate certainty based on our assessment of biases, and there's clinical consideration. So based on the systematic review, there's a set of guidelines that are being put out. Now, just to tell you, what have we learned from this? Well, I think one of the things I've learned is you can convert these systematic reviews into clinical guidelines. I mean, Kevin he was successful with primary care for refugees, and I think this will be helpful. I think, though, looking at it in a larger context, the objective is really to get as many of the 90,000 family physicians in Canada as possible in being aware and sensitive to the solutions to homelessness. It's a good time right now because there is a move in the profession to be open to targeting social determinants of health, particularly poverty, when it comes to here in Canada. But I think beyond their clinical involvement, the clinical guidelines, getting them on board they really are a very strong lobby group in Canada, and they haven't been involved to date in addressing homelessness other than providing healthcare services through the emergency shelters. So I think probably the last thing I'll say is that what's become clear to me, and I know we're going to talk about this a little more after Sarah, but I think our biggest challenge, and certainly at least in Canada, is knowledge mobilization of systematic reviews. And I really like what Howard showed in terms of these EGMs and the work that Campbell's doing to make them available, but we really got to get them into the hands of practitioners, even the public and politicians. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Tim. That's really interesting, and definitely would be interesting to pick your brains on how can we ensure to actually start making these systematic reviews a lot more accessible and easier to digest. And definitely guidelines, other types of evidence portals would be playing a role there. But before we delve into those details, we really want to hear from Sarah, who was the lead researcher working on the 3 systematic reviews that we commissioned some time ago, and that we are going to be publishing in the next couple of days and weeks. So over to you, Sarah. Basically, it would be really interesting for you to share a couple of the insights from these 3 systematic reviews, and also the key challenges that you have encountered in the process.
Thank you, Guillermo, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I should say that my background actually is education, but it is in trials and systematic reviews. So this has been a marriage between ourselves and CHI and experts in homelessness, where we've brought the methodological expertise and we have joined together with those who have the content expertise. But I am one face of a larger team, and I cannot talk about these reviews without mentioning them, and Dr. Kira Keenan and Dr. Jennifer Hanratty, Jane Hamilton and Chris Coughlin, whose lives have been dedicated to these reviews over the last year or 18 months or so. And so if you remember Howard talking about the evidence and gap map, and basically CHI commissioned us to work with them to identify areas which would be ripe for review. So where are there lots of primary studies and not very many reviews? And so in consultation with other experts in the field to identify, well, what are really the pressing topics that we need to know about, we decided, we all together decided to focus on accommodation-based programs and separately discharge programs for people who are leaving institutions such as prison or hospital, for example, and also the effectiveness of programs aimed at improving access to health and social care services. So I'm going to talk about each of those individually, but I just wanted to give you a flavour of how we came on to those topics. And there are many more topics now that the maps, even at that stage, could have led us to, and now that the map has been updated, there will be many more topics. So I think this is a really great example of how evidence and gap maps can be used as a springboard. They're fabulous in and of themselves in terms of telling us where the evidence is and where the gaps lie, but they're a fabulous springboard to doing smaller, more targeted systematic reviews in particular areas, and that's what we have done. So we're very much led by CHI and practice and policy and academic stakeholders in the area of homelessness. So the first review, which was led by Kira, really looked at accommodation-based services, and what we wanted to know was what is actually the relative effectiveness of different types of accommodation-based services. And when we started to get into the literature, we quickly realized that accommodation services are described in a multiplicity of ways, and the terminology used isn't always consistent between countries or even between people working in the area. So we came up against a little bit of a wall at the start, which was certainly probably our main challenge for this review, in terms of, well, how do we accurately describe the types of interventions that are out there? And if we want to compare their relative effectiveness, then how do we know which intervention to put into which bucket so we can compare them? So we ended up in conjunction with CHI and our other stakeholders, developing a typology. And this is a really important part of this review, so that we as the reviewers could understand, okay, this intervention that we're reading about here goes into this pot, and this intervention goes into this pot. And what we came up with was a typology. Now, it's not this, I'm not saying this is perfect or this is the way to describe accommodation-based interventions, but this is the process we went through, and certainly it will probably need to be refined and developed further. So we came up with a series of 9 types of accommodation-based interventions, and they varied according to different characteristics. So some of them were very sort of provided basic services, but there might be some conditionality attached to that. So it might be necessary for the client to be sober to avail of it. So those interventions might have conditionality, or there may be no conditionality. So they can, whatever their sobriety or circumstances, they can avail of the housing. And of course, as well, other interventions offered different lengths of intervention, different intensity of support alongside. So there were lots of different, the interventions really varied from the provision of a bed and basic subsistence, which may have had sobriety conditions attached, right through to providing stable housing, high levels of ongoing additional support, and perhaps no sobriety or conditions attached. And as I say, there were kind of 9 of those categories that we looked at. And we wanted to really understand, because what we found was if somebody describes a hostel or a shelter here in the UK, it might mean something very different in the US. So we didn't want to use those labels. We wanted to go by what the actual characteristics were. And of course, that depends on the authors describing the intervention in enough detail that you know what its characteristics are. So that's a common problem for systematic reviewers, is the level and the quality of the reporting in the primary studies. And what we found from the map, and we would no doubt find more studies now, we found 28 studies encompassing 51 papers, which were then included in our accommodation review. And most, 25 of the 28, were US based, which really echoes what both Tim and Howard have been saying about the literature in homelessness. And we were able to use what's called network meta-analysis. And the only reason I want to mention this is because it's a newly emerging type of analysis that is used more in the health sciences, but it's an example of how we can use and how we can develop these types of statistical approaches in the social sciences. So it was very exciting for us to be kind of adopting this approach and drawing on expertise within Campbell in order to do so. So we looked at the effectiveness of each type of accommodation intervention on housing stability, which was our primary outcome, and also on health outcomes as well. But we also looked at other outcomes. These were our secondary outcomes, and we did look at those as well. But the ones we were most interested were housing stability and health. We synthesized both qualitative and quantitative data from the two maps, evidence and gap maps that CHI commissioned, and we hoped to integrate the findings from both of those maps. And I'll maybe say a little bit more about some of the challenges we encountered in doing so. But what I'm mostly going to talk about is the quantitative synthesis. And what we did find was that interventions offering the highest levels of support alongside unconditional accommodation were the most effective in improving housing stability. We also found that high support and unconditional housing, along with moderate support with conditional housing, yielded better health outcomes than no intervention. So it wasn't carte blanche that everything was better than no intervention. Certainly higher support and those more intensive interventions appeared to be yielding the higher effects for housing stability, and a little less so for health outcomes as well. Unfortunately, it was not possible to synthesize the data for the other outcomes simply because of the lack of data. And this is it's a common problem across systematic reviews, but I think as well in homelessness, where there maybe isn't so much of a tradition of RCT or evaluative research. We also planned to look and see whether these interventions were more effective for younger or older people, or whether they were more effective for individuals or for families. And so again, we unfortunately didn't have enough data. So we started out with great intentions, but the data was quite limiting in what we were and weren't able to do. And we certainly don't want to go beyond our data and stretch our statistics beyond that which we are sort of confident in reporting as well. So we have to be sensible, I suppose, in what we can do as well. And then the qualitative evidence highlighted really the importance of a shared vision between policymakers and funders, community engagement, interagency communication, committed non-judgmental staff and caseworkers, and the engagement of the individuals availing of provision in their housing needs and placement in their own decision making. So that was the accommodation-based review. Actually, some quite complex findings, which I have kind of given you the top level of, but certainly when our report comes out, there will be much more detail reported there that I think will be really useful as people, for people who are perhaps working in the area. And we absolutely welcome all comments back on any of the reports that we have written for CHI, and that continued engagement actually is really important. So the second review that we looked at was looking at how to improve access to health and social care services, and what's the effectiveness of programs that have specifically aimed to do that. We know that homelessness increases the risk of poor physical and mental health, and so the requirement to access health and social care is increased, but can be extremely challenging for a number of reasons, which can include the fact that not all countries have free healthcare system, food and shelter might be a priority, and lack of documentation, for example, might be a barrier. And what we found was that actually those interventions that specifically aim to improve access to interventions, mostly by increasing the availability of the intervention and making it more available to clients, that they were actually effective in improving accessibility, that people attended more mental health appointments, and that they were more in contact with the programs to which they were participating in. So we did find that there was a noticeable impact of those programs. We also looked again at secondary outcomes, and we found that there was some positive effects in other areas as well, such as well-being and social support. But what we can be less clear about or conclusive about is whether it is improving access or perhaps other dimensions of the access programs, because sometimes access programs were provided just on their own. Sometimes they were provided with housing support. We attempted to look at whether those two categories of interventions differed, but unfortunately there was insufficient data to do that. So again, another positive finding, and certainly in terms of the primary outcome, in terms of those programs aiming to increase accessibility. And again, the qualitative analysis really highlighted the importance of increased capacity for caseworkers, high quality training in terms of provision of services, and the importance of multidisciplinary teams and collaboration between agencies, and a shared culture and vision in that respect. And the very final review that I'm just going to mention, I feel like I'm giving you the fastest, most whistle-stop tour of our reviews, is the discharge review. And that's the first one that's actually going to come out. It's perhaps smaller than the other reviews, which were quite large, and it synthesized evidence from 13 studies. And what we found, and this review synthesized the evidence on programs aimed at preventing or reducing the risk of homelessness for people leaving institutional settings, such programs might involve the coordination and provision of services for people upon discharge in an attempt to prevent readmission, relapse or recidivism. And we did find that there was an improvement in the primary outcome, and that discharge programs were effective in increasing housing stability. They also were effective to a smaller degree in decreasing hospitalizations and reducing incarceration as well. So we did the same moderator analyses that I mentioned before. Are they more effective? These programs more effective for certain groups of people, but unfortunately the data didn't allow us to actually answer those questions. Systematic reviews can answer those questions, which is amazing, but you need the data from the primary studies to be reported and to be there in order for us to do so. Grandma, I don't know whether you want me to kind of sort of talk about the challenges as well.
Yeah, I think if you can summarize a couple of those challenges in a minute or two, that would be absolutely brilliant.
I will do my best. So I think I probably mentioned some of them. So really important that the team had all the expertise that was required, and all the expertise did not lie with one person or with a small number of people. So we had to create the team, CHI had to create the team in order to bring all of that expertise to bear. So that included us as the methodological experts, CHI and their collaborators, academic experts, but policymakers and practitioners in the field as well. So it was really important that we had all of those perspectives in order for us to be able to have the guidance and the knowledge that we needed to make certain decisions throughout the systematic review process. Certainly a common language was required, and I mentioned that for the accommodation review. It wasn't so much of an issue for the other two reviews, but that was something that we could not have done without our collaboration and our partners in order to understand what is the best way to actually view and think about accommodation-based programs. And I think integrating the qualitative and quantitative evidence, I think probably was a little bit more challenging than we had maybe anticipated, because the qualitative evidence did not come from the same studies as the quantitative evidence. And one of the reasons for that sometimes is that quantitative studies don't necessarily report their process evaluations alongside their quantitative, or certainly not in detail. So I think we need to, certainly from a primary study perspective, but also from a review perspective, to perhaps think more carefully about how we might integrate those two types of evidence, because one of my kind of bigger point is that evidence comes from lots of different areas, and we want to always be synthesizing and looking for the robust evidence, but sometimes other evidence gets left behind because we don't have a way of synthesizing it. And these methods are increasingly being developed, and I think we need to incorporate other evidence when we can and where we can as well. So I'm going to stop there and go back to you, Guillermo.
Thank you, Sarah. There's actually a really interesting question from one of the attendees that we can probably relate to some of the things that you have been saying, which is about the differences and the difficulties of actually conducting systematic reviews in social sciences in comparison to health or other more scientific ways. Just because of the complexity of how these programs are created and the multiple outcomes on which they might be having some bearing. So can you say a bit more around those potential complexities of doing this in social sciences vis-a-vis other areas?
Definitely, and that complexity is very difficult then to translate when you're working in a systematic review. So there's the complexity of the intervention and the fact that social science or a social intervention generally has many moving parts, and it can be very difficult to actually understand the utility or effectiveness of each of those moving parts. But then when you are trying to combine interventions together, it's often very hard to actually, and this is one thing that systematic reviews can be criticized for, is that you're kind of lumping apples with oranges. And so when you've got interventions that can look very different from a medical intervention that might just have only a few variants in the social sciences, there can be lots of variations of what's described as the same thing. I also think our reporting probably needs to be improved, and I know that that is improving, because also it's the case with the complexity of outcomes in terms of operationalizing outcomes, what we mean by that and how we measure it. And in social sciences, we can definitely measure lots of outcomes in lots of different ways, and not all of those are good or have good psychometric properties. So I think there's lots of dimensions where there's complexity in the study that then kind of gets magnified then in the review. I don't know that there's a particular answer, but I know people are working, in terms of trying to incorporate that and make it so that we are being more specific in our language about what we are intervening with and what we are measuring.
Absolutely. And the way that we're approaching this is that even though there's, of course, a relevant complexity that we need to acknowledge, it's about how can potentially mitigate some of those key elements and ensure that we are defining really narrow questions that then we can answer more effectively. So I think that even though it's definitely more complex and it's definitely more difficult in some regard, it's also absolutely relevant for us to be conducting reviews in social sciences.
It's not a reason not to do it.
Relevant.
Yeah.
It's about what else can be done rather than disregarding completely these methods as a relevant point. I'm conscious of time, basically because we have only a handful of minutes more. So I wanted to pick Howard's and Tim's brains on how can we actually make systematic reviews a lot more accessible and easier to digest. So both of you were discussing guidelines and evidence portals, but what do you think are those next innovations on how we can just ensure that systematic reviews are acted on? So how can we ensure that these are as easy to translate into actual policy making? So you were mentioning these as a couple of examples. Are there any other key aspects that you have been thinking on or that you think we should be investing on? Tim, would you mind starting there?
Well, I think as a researcher, we have to take responsibility for the knowledge mobilization strategies. You got to go beyond the systematic reviews, because other than researchers, people just don't have the time, first of all, and it's too hard to wade through. So I think we look at all of the strategies that are available today. Obviously, is important. Ads are important because it gets to politicians. We need common language summaries of reviews that are brief, that can be circulated, sent out to people in the field, and again to policymakers. So I think it's really, I think now research, it doesn't end when you publish. To some extent, that's just the beginning if you want something to have impact, like a systematic review.
Absolutely, Tim. So Howard, just to wrap up, if you were to summarize one key recommendation for researchers, for funders, and for policymakers when using systematic reviews and try to influence policy, what would you say to those three key stakeholders?
Right, so in response to the last point, so I used to think when I first got engaged with systematic reviews, which is just over a decade ago now, that the problem is the product, because they're long, they're complicated, they're not very interesting to read, with no clear narrative. And that's partly true. And one of the things we did when I was in my previous organization, 3i, which was funding and producing reviews, was we in some cases produced what we called policy-friendly version of a report. Would be a 20, 30 page at max, 20 page max, glossy report, which summarized a more narrative story version of the review, with the review being a sort of technical, freestanding technical report. And of course, we do plain language summaries, policy briefs as well. But I don't actually think that's, I think you should do that. I don't think that's the answer. It's commonly said these days in the sort of knowledge brokering community but traditional dissemination methods are dead, they don't work, and we know that. So that's sort of the ex-post dissemination, where you do a study, then you go out and disseminate it. And so to have policy engagement, you want to have ex-ante, to have policy engagement, you need to have ex-ante engagement with policy decision makers to determine what the questions are, shape the questions, to help them understand the findings and so on. And I agree with that, but actually I'll go even a step further, and this is where I'm trying to locate Campbell's work in this space. For example, I work with CHI and other work centres, is you want to institutionalise use of evidence. And that's exactly what the top levels of the pyramid do. So this is much more clearly done in health with NICE in the UK, WHO globally. So WHO have what I call the guidelines of producing guidelines, the handbook of guideline development. It says WHO guidelines have to be based on high quality systematic reviews. So the institutionalizing use of evidence. So exactly the same way EEF has done its evidence portal based on systematic reviews. So institutionalizing use of reviews from the start. And so if you really want reviews to be used, you need a system that's going to make evidence, decision-making products based on evidence. And that can only happen at the systems level. And so Campbell's talking to agencies about trying to change their systems to ensure they do high quality, preferably Campbell reviews, to build into guidelines and portals. And it's happening. It's happening more in the UK than the US. In the US, where there are many what work centres and evidence portals on many topics, many are based on single studies. So there's some work that David Goff, the Epicenter, and I did for CHI, viewing evidence standards across what work centres. And the evidence standards are what constitutes as valid evidence to go into a guideline or a portal. And we see many of the US evidence standards being much weaker. There was a portal launch last week, but doesn't have evidence standards. It just takes interventions from other portals and just applies the same evidence standards, evidence rating of that portal, which are different from portal to portal. So that makes no sense whatsoever. So there's some portals out there that do not a very good job on this, but the ones in the UK, actually what works in the UK, are being mostly held up to a high standard. CHI is a leader there, and hopefully the rising tide will lift all boats, and the other centres will come along to the levels of CHI in the end. IF is already there as well. So the what work centres, I think, are a good example how you institutionalise your evidence. And in the end, it doesn't mean that every researcher working with Sarah has to be doing that, because the point is it's done at a systems level. So then actually the work of individual researchers in a way becomes less, because they need to write relevant reviews and answer the policy questions, but they're doing the review as part of the building blocks, part of the evidence pyramid. And knowledge, someone else, a knowledge brokering agency like CHI is doing that work of building the top levels of the pyramid based on the foundations coming from the researchers. So we had that model really in place, and actually, no, it just happens, basically. That's what the evidence revolution is about, is making that just happen.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Howard. With those last comments, I would actually like to close the session. It was absolutely brilliant to have the three of you. Thank you so much for sharing your views and your insights into how we can be using systematic reviews and how you have been doing so in your specific contexts. And basically, thank you to everyone else who attended. And just to remind you that we're going to continue having a couple of sessions for the rest of the week. So do go to our website and continue joining us for the rest of this last week of the Impact Festival. Thank you.
Will this go online? We can see it later on. No.